right. Good afternoon and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. My name is Celine Coggins and I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education. And we are glad you're joining us today for Racial Disparities in School Discipline. How do they relate to achievement? So we've got a great session for you all today. We're starting with Dr. Francis Pearman, who's a professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. He is joined today by Marlon Stiles, the Superintendent of Middletown City School District in Ohio, and also John Garcia and Steve Purcell in the LA County Office of Education's philanthropic arm. And so I, just a little over a month ago, saw some research that came out that said racial disparities in school discipline are linked to the achievement gap between Black and white students. And there was the first national study of its kind on that topic. And this is a topic that I know is near and dear to the hearts of many of those of us in this community. And so I figured this really hits on equity, it hits on restorative justice, it hits on the school to prison pipeline, a lot of the issues that those of us in this community are trying to grapple with and learn about. And so we're here to talk, number one, about what does the research say? Number two, what's happening in schools. Marlon is a member of the League of Innovative Schools and they do some great work. And then finally, what can philanthropy do? So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Pearman, and I want to draw all of your attention in the audience to the chat box. What I'll be doing throughout is checking the chat box and checking the Q&A, and anything that you want to ask, just throw it up there and I'll make sure that it gets asked. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I think this is going to be a great afternoon. All right, Dr. Pearman.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Celine, and thank you all for your attendance and being interested in this subject that is certainly near and dear to my heart as well. So I'm going to talk about results from a study that I published recently along with some, fellow collaborators at Florida and Louisville and Vanderbilt, Joseph Gardella, Chris Curran, and Ben Fisher, called our achievement gaps related to discipline gaps, evidence from national data. What I would like to do, for some reason my screen I'm not able to control at the moment. Okay, there we go. So quickly, I'd like to provide just a brief overview of well, the motivation of the study, and then talk a little more about sort of the study details without getting into the nitty gritty of it. Then spend a decent amount of time talking about the main takeaways from the study, and then also suggest some possible opportunities moving forward, both for research, really for funding that's sort of centered on kind of gaps in this kind of general domain of research. So the motivation for this study, we've known for about as long as we've had reliable estimates that students of color, Black students, Latinx students, perform poorer on average than their white counterparts. And there's certainly been the whole sort of cottage industry of research that's attempted to kind of shed light on the origins and the consequences of those disparities for students and schools, both in the short and long term. Now, in the last perhaps 2 decades or so, we've also begun to understand the extent to which Black and brown students are suspended and expelled, experience exclusionary, other forms of exclusionary punishment. We've come to a deeper appreciation of how rates at which students of color are suspended, expelled, face sort of the exclusionary arm of public schools. We've come to a deeper appreciation of how big, how much higher those rates are for students of color than their white counterparts. So those two sort of disparities that I'm referring to, or that I'm talking about, are what are conventionally known as the racial achievement gap and the racial discipline gap. Now, despite sort of the broad interest in each of those two disparities, there's actually surprisingly little knowledge about the connection between those two disparities. So the reason why sort of a study examining those connections to me is exciting is that or was exciting at least when we began it was that sort of the evidence of there being some relation between the achievement gap and the discipline gap is quite robust. However, the direction of the relationship is really unclear. And the first point I'm making about the evidence in favor of there being some relationship between them being robust, that's largely indirect evidence, like conceptual evidence, theoretical arguments for why there would be or should be a relationship between those two gaps. Kind of in that sort of broad space where there's a lot of studies, a lot of sort of voices sort of screaming at what one would expect there to be. The direction of the relationship is actually unclear based on that work. For instance, we've known based on some work from my colleague Sean Reardon here at Stanford that over the last 20 years or so, the Black-white achievement gap has actually declined somewhat. Now it's still certainly detectable and a cause for concern, but it has in fact declined over that period. Now, during that same period, the discipline disparities between Black and white students in particular has actually increased substantially. So those two sort of secular trends, a declining achievement gap and the growth in the discipline gap, would seem to suggest actually a negative relationship, a negative correlation between those two disparities. That would seem to suggest that as as achievement gaps have gotten smaller, discipline gaps have actually gotten worse, perhaps as a consequence of that, perhaps simply tracking with that. So there's like that there's a lot of work sort of in that space, right? Moreover, there's some work recently in several small districts in Arkansas, in Kentucky, that sort of point to some research that suggests that as students are suspended or expelled from school, as disruptive students are suspended or expelled from schools, there is actually potentially positive spillover effects on their classmates, right? So if you suspend poorly behaved students, then the classroom benefits as a result of that, right? There's some work to suggest that could be the case as well. Now, on the other side of things, right, there's perhaps there's sort of a broader, a larger body of research that suggests that sort of suspensions and expulsions can have really serious adverse consequences on students' engagement. Individual students, the students who are suspended or expelled, could have these negative consequences on their engagement and success in school, right? And that sort of logic is pretty straightforward. I mean, if you're sending students out of school, out of classrooms, sending them home, whether it's ISS or out of school suspension, they're in the learning environment less, right? And if you're in the learning environment less, there's fewer opportunities to learn, right? So there's quite a bit of work in that space as well. So the point is the direction of the relationship based on some of this theoretical work, some of these small scale studies based on a single district, has led to sort of a fair amount of confusion about what we should understand about the connection between the achievement gap and the discipline gap. And the point that I just made is sort of evidence of this fact that this relationship hasn't been modeled at the national level, right? So when we're talking about really important issues of equity in schools, framing up that conversation with what we know at sort of the population level is really important, right? There's this habit that social scientists, there's this habit that the media in particular has about social science, social scientific research that's very local in nature. Oftentimes, the narratives about studies can be sort of blown out of proportion, and to the point where we start talking about things that happen at the very local level as sort of case in point for what's happening at the national level. But that shouldn't be done. And for that reason, it's really important to sort of understand what this relationship looks like at the national level. And part of this gap, this literature gap, is likely due to limitations of data, right? The Civil Rights Data Collection has been collecting data on discipline patterns for the sort of the universe of U.S. school districts for the last couple decades, but we haven't had similar measures of achievement, comparable measures of achievement across the United States, or across districts and schools across the United States until very recently. So the research questions for this study are kind of threefold. One, just simply, are racial discipline gaps related to racial achievement gaps in school districts across the United States? If so, what is the magnitude of these relationships? And then finally, do these relationships persist after accounting for observable differences across school districts? And what that last question is getting to is it's really trying to provide a clear understanding about the unique relation between these two gaps, because it's possible that the discipline gap and the achievement gap, for instance, could be related to one another, but because districts that suspend a lot of their students are disproportionately Black and brown, and those same districts and districts that are disproportionately Black and brown have lower achievement. So perhaps the relationship is simply due to differences of racial composition, right? So we want to.
I think we have a couple of questions. One I think is better for practitioners, but are you defining achievement only by test results?
Yes. So in this study, we're defining achievement strictly in terms of achievement on statewide assessments.
Thanks.
Was there another question?
No, I'm going to hold that one for the practitioner side. You can describe the study.
Okay, great. So the data, the question that was just asked had to do with the type of data that we use, that we're using. So we are using achievement data on statewide assessments gathered from the Stanford Education Data Archive, which is just an incredible contribution to the field of educational research, led by, again, my colleague here, Sean Reardon. We gathered discipline data from the Civil Rights Data Collection. This is also a longitudinal study. It's not terribly long in scope, but we're looking at two time periods: 2011-12 school year and 2013-14 school year. What this allows us to do is it allows us to look at changes that occur within a given district, right? And look at sort of on average what happens when a given district increases its discipline disparities, what happens to its achievement disparities, what happens when a district's achievement disparities grow, what are the sort of analogous changes to discipline disparities in that same district. And what that allows us to do is not only rule out sort of observable differences across districts, but also what's called time invariant unobservable differences across districts. All that means is the point that I mentioned a moment ago about sort of studying the unique contribution of each of these gaps to the other, sort of studying using sort of these methods where you look over time across each district individually. That gives you a lot of confidence about the fact that you're ruling out sort of confounding factors. And just to be clear, this is a district level analysis, and we're looking at grades 3 through 8. And the reason for that is just those are simply the grade span for which schools and districts are required to have statewide achievement, or required for students to take achievement tests. Statewide achievement tests, excuse me. So the key findings of this study, there's several. One, districts with larger discipline gaps have larger achievement gaps, and vice versa, right? So this work sort of stands in contrast to some of the local work that I mentioned earlier, where suspensions were actually increasing achievement for students in their surrounding, in their broader classroom. What this work is suggesting is that at scale, that pattern doesn't hold up. As discipline gaps go up, so too do achievement gaps. As achievement gaps go down, so too do discipline gaps. Now, when controlling for differences across school districts, as I mentioned, sort of that last research question was about sort of narrowing the focus to sort of the unique contribution of each gap to the other. What we find is that the connection between Hispanic-white discipline gap and Hispanic-white achievement gap actually goes away. That means that sort of the connection between those two gaps is actually due to other differences across school districts. However, the gap actually remains for when sort of talking about disparities between Black and white students. The other sort of notable point about this pattern is when we did some sort of supplementary analyses in this paper where we weren't just simply looking at the relationship between achievement gap and discipline gap, which is what I've been talking about this whole time. But we also looked at achievement levels and discipline levels by race and looked at sort of the connection between those two outcomes. And what we found, which was really interesting, is that suspension rates predict achievement patterns, or suspension levels predict achievement levels for only Black students. Similarly, achievement levels predict discipline levels only for Black students. Those two levels don't predict each other with respect to Hispanic students or white students. What that means is that sort of the mechanisms connecting achievement to discipline, right, whatever they may be, whether we're talking about teacher biases, whether we're talking about students' sense of belonging in school, those mechanisms are in all likelihood more salient for Black students than any other racial group. So the key sort of takeaways from these main findings, there's been a lot of work recently to sort of focus directly on achievement disparities. In addition to that, there's been a lot of work that's focused sort of on addressing discipline disparities, right? This is the restorative justice movement. This is the positive behavioral and support initiatives. And a lot of these initiatives have sort of been siloed from one another, right? We talk about sort of addressing discipline disparities or attempts to address discipline disparities as focused exclusively on discipline disparities. But what this work is seeming to suggest is that these efforts to address one gap or one disparity, one racial disparity, could in all likelihood have spillover effects on the other disparity. So this work is in part sort of an argument to sort of think more expansively about the consequences of our efforts to address any one particular gap. And opportunities moving forward, and I'm happy to talk more about those key takeaways during the Q&A, but I want to pass the mic along. Opportunities moving forward, a lot of this work around discipline disparities in schools has focused disproportionately on what we might think of as exclusionary outcomes, right? As out of school suspension, in school suspension, expulsion, right? And for good reason, right? I mean, these are the rates of disparities along these measures is stark along racial terms. But as districts have become increasingly aware of the potentially adverse consequences associated with discipline disparities, and as the federal government until recently has kind of kept a lot of districts' feet to the fire about reducing so what we think of Black, white, or Hispanic, white discipline disparities. As schools have continued to reduce some of these disparities, and there have been some good efforts along those lines. That doesn't mean that sort of racism or bias within the sort of the disciplinary arena goes away, right? We can, as districts are not kicking students out of school, right? As schools are not suspending students out of school, that doesn't mean that those students are necessarily being treated in an equitable way within schools or within classrooms, right? So the point I'm raising is I think there's going to be a lot of need for work really at the moment, and certainly over the next couple of years, to get better data about less punitive disciplinary outcomes or disciplinary procedures, right? So referrals, for instance, are something that are generally not tracked, certainly at the national level, but in many cases not even at the district level. But some of these referrals can be sort of indicative, again, of particular racial disparities that are taking place within schools, right? At perhaps, again, the less punitive forms of punishment, but that nevertheless can have incredible impacts on students' engagement and, again, success in school. So I'm happy to talk more about any of those. I'm going to stop there and pass the mic.
Thank you, Dr. Pearman. Fascinating. There's so much in there, and I can see the questions popping up. I'm going to give the mic, though, first to Marlon Stiles, who is a superintendent, who is living with issues like this every day, trying to figure out what to do as a practitioner. I got to spend a couple of days last week with Dr. Stiles, both listening to him speak and touring together some of the equity initiatives that are happening in Toronto, Ontario. And so, I knew that his work really tapped into this. And so I'd love to hear from you, Superintendent Stiles, on your reflections on the research, how it connects to what you're doing in your district.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. And Ms. Coggins, appreciate you inviting us to share a little bit about Middletown City Schools and weigh in on the conversation. I was looking down a lot because I was scribbling a ton of notes as Dr. Pearman was sharing some of the research, so I could take it back to my executive team. Just a little bit about Middletown City School District. We are a 100% free and reduced lunch rate school district serving about 6,200 urban students in your textbook definition of an urban district. We're awfully proud of who we are as a district and how we are serving our students. Some early reflections that I wrote down, just some things that I took away, 3 very high level things that really stand out to me, I think that are important to this conversation, is to number one, no matter what public sector you're in as far as education, the important thing is to know your students, know the profile of your student body, have a very strong command and grasp of the profile of your community that you are serving, so that you can begin to think about systemically how you can start to shift the structures and practices and beliefs and policies inside your district. A key piece for us is that we take a lot of pride in making sure that our urban students feel connected to our schools. And we believe that has had a significant impact, not just on our achievement data, but our discipline data as well. We really talk a lot with our staff and as a district about keeping our students in the classroom. That's something that Dr. Pearman mentioned before. Although we celebrate not having any concerns around disproportionality inside of our discipline data, although we are celebrating a decrease in both out-of-school suspensions and expulsions, I'm happy to share some of the practices and supports we put in place to cause some of that. But specifically in relation to what Dr. Pearman said, we definitely are taking a deeper dive into our in-school discipline data that still continues to surface. The mentality of keeping kids in the classroom is yielding some positive impact on our discipline data, but also our achievement data as well and our growth data. But we still know we have a lot of work left to do around how we're addressing and interacting with students when behaviors do surface. Number 2.
Just say more real quickly about how you are reducing suspensions and expulsions.
Sure. So we have, as a district, being a high poverty urban district, inside of our strategic plan, we've set some very strategic priorities inside of our strategic plan to really talk about and bring awareness to the adults that serve our students. So we have done a district-wide poverty simulation where every single employee in our district, myself included, board members included, city officials included, we've gone through a month-long simulation over the course of several hours to get a true understanding of what it feels like to live in high poverty. We wanted our adults to be aware of the family circumstances that many of our students go home to every single day, with the hopes that awareness starts to cause some self-reflection in how we choose to approach educating kids in an urban environment. That was 2 years ago. This school year, we have the same mentality of every single employee. We're actually talking a lot and having a deep dive around cultural bias. So that's a big push right now. The thinking there, again, is just awareness as adults so that we can begin to dig, hopefully, in our next strategic plan into changing some of those practices and beliefs with individual educators. Then the other side of that, what I mentioned before about our expectation of keeping students in the learning environment at a higher rate when behaviors do surface. We put some supports in place this school year that we are having a big impact on. At our high school, we actually eliminated the traditional dean position. You think about a high school dean, their job is to receive discipline and issue consequences. How effective is that in turning a student around? So we actually flipped the coin on the other side and we instituted what we're calling a community liaison. We have a young man who is basically a kid magnet. His job is to proactively prevent students from from not being able to access the learning because of any potential discipline. Students who display a little bit of consistency with discipline, he meets with them on a frequent basis to just talk about plans and supports that he can put in place and connect them to resources to shift some of that thinking and behavior well in advance before any discipline shows up. At our elementary levels, we have instituted behavior technicians. I know it's not a big fancy term, it's the best we could come up with. But the role is to have a behavior technician work with classroom teachers to observe behaviors of students in the classroom, sit down with the teacher and talk about practices, strategies, and plans that can be put into place so that the teacher begins to have better success, allowing the student to access the learning and preventing some of those behaviors. Those two things are just some ideal supports that we've really seen a huge impact on this year.
I have a couple of questions I think that are best pitched to you. So one is, what happens to those students who are suspended and expelled? How does it affect their view of themselves and as learners and contributors? And then this notion of internalized racial oppression and their sense of themselves.
Yeah, the one thing that we are lucky here in Middletown City Schools, being a very diverse district, just by nature and historically, our student body embraces that diversity. So that's been a huge help for us. And I know that's a blessing that we have culturally, and we lean on that relatively heavily. So we have instituted additional opportunities for students to have a sense of belonging inside of our schools. I'll talk about some course offerings here in just a moment. We strategically have talked about how can we increase opportunities to be connected to the school environment. So we have an increase in clubs, extracurricular activities. We've diversified those significantly so that students have a sense of belonging and they feel welcomed. We've got an international club we run at the high school that has students from all different countries. We do have career pathways that we allow students to explore and just figure out what they want to be when they grow up. At the elementaries, we've got an elementary, Mayfield Elementary, that has a total of 11 different after-school clubs for elementary students. We've applied for innovation grants for 21st century grants at the state level. We offer those in two of our most high poverty elementaries. So that's allowed students to feel a sense of belonging. We celebrate National Heritage Month. We celebrate Black History Month with open arms, and we feel comfortable doing that. At the recent Toronto Equity Summit that Dr. Coggins was part of, we celebrated some of those course offerings that we put in place to give our students a sense of belonging. We had a young African-American female teacher in the English department sit with some of our students and dreamed up what a modern African-American studies course would actually feel like and look like, what the students spend to it. And creatively, like kids always come up with, we put a pop culture spin to it. And it's allowed students of all makeups, both African-American and white students, to be in that classroom and express, understand, feel what it means to be a minority in a public school system and historically. So we've focused intentionally on opportunities and access in many different ways, both during the school day with courses, supports human personnel, adults for students and staff, but more importantly, just making sure we focus on making sure kids have an awareness and being connected to the school community.
Awesome. All right, well, I am going to turn it over to John and to Steve to ask the question, what can philanthropy do? What are we doing in philanthropy? And I want to urge those of you who joined late or who haven't done so yet, throw some questions in the Q&A, throw some questions in the chat box, and I will make sure I get to them after we hear from John and Steve. Thank you so much, guys.
No, thank you, Celine. So Steve and I, we're gonna, tag team on this a little bit, but super excited to chat about this. So Greater LA Education Foundation is the philanthropic arm of the LA County Office of Education. So we're just gonna have a quick kind of chat around the context of California and LA, and then we'll kind of dive into kind of some of the philanthropic work that we've seen folks kind of get into to support this work. And I just want to say, even before this, that the work in the discipline space for education has not just been folks in education, but it's also been folks on the justice side. There's been advocates and lots of community folks involved in this. And I do think it's one of the most successful kind of areas of focus that philanthropy has been engaged in over the last few years. So I'm having a little trouble moving the slide to the next screen here. There we go. Okay. Just a little bit of a delay there. So yes, I mentioned we're going to talk about the current environment. We're going to talk a little bit about LAUSD, and then we're also going to talk about the county's effort to support some of the 80 districts in this space, and then we'll jump into philanthropy, but also there's also challenges that still remain in this space, and definitely want to jump into that as well. So just a quick overview, we did see a large decrease in suspensions overall in Los Angeles, in the 11-12 school year, 710,000 all the way down to 363,000. But we still see large disproportionality among certain student groups in the impact of that. A large part of this was focused on willful defiance and disruption, and that was a big, area of focus for discipline, and really trying to have a significant drop in that space. And a lot of that is really around how that's defined, right? It's a disruption in school activities. It's just, disrupting any performance of duties by any folks in the school space, which creates a lot of subjectivity in that space. And you can see here, we did have a dramatic decrease, as I mentioned, throughout the years, where we're down quite significantly, down to 59,808 overall. But we'll also show some of the disparities in that space that still remain, that I want to get to. So overall, Oakland and LA Unified did ban the use of willful defiance overall. Even when you take out willful defiance in that work, there still was a 19% kind of statewide drop in defiance and disruption suspensions. But you still, as I mentioned, see huge gaps. And you did see big, large drops even for African American and Native American students. But you do still see that African American students are 3 times as likely to be suspended as their white peers, and that still is the case. And I'll show you a little bit about what that looks like. So as you can see, from 2012 to 2018, significant decreases percentage-wise, but still, categorically, we're still kind of in the same place, even though the raw numbers and percentages have gone down, but we still do see certain groups, being singled out in this space. So I want to turn it over to Steve to kind of run through our current environment and where we're at, policy-wise, but also what's happening in some of the districts, and also with the county office and what we're up to as well.
Appreciate it, John. Somewhat recently, last September, Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law sort of restrictions on the use of willful defiance. And that was sort of pretty big because as John mentioned before, sort of the willful defiance suspension sort of category was used a lot, and it sort of invited a lot of subjectivity in terms of like, what is willful defiance? And I think from the governor's office, by sort of putting restrictions on that ban, there was an effort to also provide some funding in terms of thinking through how do you provide alternative forms of suspension. And so that's what the $15 million grant was for. And so what I'm getting at here is the state, California, stepped in to sort of put restrictions on willful defiance and how it's being used. And they provided some funding in terms of thinking through what are some other alternative forms of suspension. And now, so the next couple of slides, as John mentioned, I want to kind of lift up the way in which Los Angeles Unified School District has had sort of approached this work. And the reason why they're somewhat ahead of the curve in terms of this area of willful defiance and how to sort of reduce suspensions, particularly in that area. So we kind of want to lift up what they did in this specific space. So as years before California banned or put restriction on willful defiance, LA Unified actually banned it. And so May of 2013, LA Unified Board voted to ban the use of willful defiance. Prior to that, the district had in place sort of the zero tolerance policy, which I think most of us sort of know that really led to a large amounts of suspensions. And so in 2013, they put a ban on using willful defiance as one of the suspension codes that most schools were using. And that led to and by doing that, by banning sort of use of willful defiance, that led to the district really taking on the sort of restorative justice approach. And so this was a huge lift in sort of bringing on this new way in terms of like dealing with suspension, given that they banned the use of willful defiance. So it was both sort of I think a pretty effective strategy of, yes, if we're going to ban the use of willful defiance, what ways or alternative ways are we going to use to sort of, deal with suspension? And in the case of LAUSD, it was really about using restorative justice as a new approach in terms of dealing with suspensions. And since adopting this new approach in terms of banning willful defiance and then really bringing on restorative justice, they saw a 75% decrease in suspensions overall. And so in this particular slide, you can see from 2011-2012 to 2017-2018 school year, you can see the total suspension reduction. And if you look at sort of defiance only, you can see the huge reduction in defiance. And so what I'm getting at here is that sort of ban of using willful defiance has led to reduction in suspension. And I also think the use of restorative justice may have contributed to suspension reductions as well. There's a study, USC Oscar School of Education study, that studied sort of the events around suspensions at USC. And what they found was there was somewhat of a narrowing of the disparities. So Latino students were suspended at similar rates as whites and Asian students. But however, African-American students were still suspended at a higher rate than their white peers. Now, advocates will have voiced that the policy ban to stop the use of willful defiance was a huge step in the right direction, which has led to a large decrease in instructional days lost. However, advocates also share that there's more work that needs to be done around the culture shift from school discipline to positive interventions and de-escalation. Now, from the county perspective, so from Los Angeles County of Ed, has played a role as well in terms of really providing technical assistance or support to school districts in terms of like their approach to discipline. And so what I mean by that, one of the roles that LA County has provided or provided support to school districts is this process or a way of adopting positive behavior intervention and support. And so the county has served as sort of a technical assistance or a provider of training, really helping school districts adopt this new model. And what this model really does is really focuses on positive behavior in school climate, really thinking through how do we recognize positive behavior, how do you create a school environment that really sort of intervenes when good behavior is being done by the students, and how do you sort of infuse that into your teaching, your modeling, your recognizing, and your reward practices to really sort of help reduce unnecessary discipline and really promote a really positive climate and school culture. And at the county, we recognize that PBIS is one way of supporting this work in terms of really thinking about how do we really shift the culture around what school discipline looks like. But they also do recognize and try to weave in classroom management support, restorative justice practices, family engagement, implicit bias trainings. And so the idea is, from the county perspective, how do we help school districts sort of build capacity to do this work and really serve as like a partner in helping them adopt this sort of new model in terms of like how to address and create a really positive behavior on school grounds.
Let me ask one question because it's sensitive to what you're discussing. Is this a tiered intervention?
Yes, so there's a tiered intervention that the county helps school districts adopt. They provide training to school districts who want to sort of adopt the PBIS model, and it is a sort of a tiered approach.
Yeah, and they weave this into the multi-tiered system of support, which the state uses and the county supports as well. Yeah. So I'm just going to transition to a little bit to talk about philanthropy, and philanthropy's kind of place in supporting this work. So as you can see, especially in the LA context, we have a lot of education advocates, a lot of justice advocates who have been involved in this for a number of years, that have engaged not only at the local kind of LAUSD and kind of district levels to shift and transition those district policies. And it's, I think it's been really impactful where districts have led the way in this space, and then have pushed the state over time to adopt kind of statewide policies and support and a philosophy that they would get behind. Of course, we heard from researchers. There's been lots of different research. We heard in the kind of discipline space, the school to prison pipeline research that's out there, research around achievement gaps related to discipline and otherwise that have been a big part in kind of pushing this work forward. As Steve mentioned, there's been support from the philanthropic space to support restorative justice in schools. To help think about school climate and PBIS models, and as you mentioned, Celine, these multi-tier systems of supports and kind of implementation of those across school districts. And I would say like now that work is moving just beyond school discipline, but really thinking about school culture and working with leaders and so forth in that space as well. And as I mentioned, district leadership and boards that kind of now have equity approaches or an equity focus that we've seen. You do see districts like Oakland and others kind of taking this on, creating new positions, philanthropy coming in to kind of subsidize or start kind of seed those positions hopefully over time being adopted by districts and supported by districts. And as I mentioned, there's a host of kind of equity initiatives in districts that philanthropy has been supportive of and helped either on the research side or help seed or provided technical assistance to support, right, around mindsets, implicit bias work that's evolving, teacher of color initiatives that we continue to see growing, especially around like retention and pipeline. African-American male achievement, initiatives like in Oakland, for example, looking at mentoring in different programs. And then in California, a big equity policy that was, a lot of folks are behind was local control funding formula, which is a student-weighted funding formula that's out there that provides, weights or additional kind of resources depending on high-need student groups. And there was actually a push on the policy side to have African-American students as part of that formula. And, I think folks are trying to move to that space. But we have seen in LAUSD an additional set of indicators, additional set of weights based on neighborhood factors and things added into that funding formula, which is an interesting place where advocates continue to push. And then I don't want to leave out the community-based organizations who have been really, I think, even out in front of the districts in a lot of ways around programs, for African-American males or Latino males or, high-need students, and thinking about how do we support them through mentoring programs, how do we support them through, STEM initiatives, college career initiatives. And I do see more of the CBOs actually taking on a focus on not only students of color, but also thinking about like males in those CBO organizations. A lot of times, there's disproportionality gender-wise in that space. Not to say that we don't want to think about our young ladies, we still do, but we also want to think about how can we make sure more males are taking advantage of those programs than before. And then we do see a host of these initiatives really, popping up as well. My Brother's Keeper, we have Bloom Initiative, Brother Son Selves that exist in LA that are kind of consortiums or collaboratives really focusing on our like African-American males or Latino males out there and supporting them. And then I don't want to leave out our folks kind of that have been working on the justice side. We have like Youth Justice Coalition. We have other justice advocates who've been really, focused on the school to prison pipeline and thinking about that from their perspective and kind of linking up with the education space on the policy side to really push for a lot of these state policies and local district policies that have changed over time.
John, that's a great inventory of the landscape and the different ways that funders can be involved. But I have a good question that kind of puts you on the spot. So obviously no funder can do everything. So the question that I have for you is, should philanthropic support be focused on supporting systemic change at the school or the district level? So where's the balance there? Or should we be supporting community-based organizations working in education justice that hold schools and districts accountable in dismantling racial inequities in schools? So it's not an either or, obviously, but how do you think about, heaviest level of investment, top priority, where you've seen the greatest leverage and the greatest outcomes across this kind of landscape that you laid out?
Well, I would say, Celine, no matter what you do, if you're a funder that doesn't get into policy or doesn't get in these high level things that, that's just not your space and you're focusing more on CBOs, I think no matter, or if you're doing vice versa and you don't do a lot of work with CBOs and you're just heavy policy and research, I think you need to think about coordinating your work with either way together, right? Because, if you're, for example, at my previous foundation, California Community Foundation, we seeded and created the Bloom Initiative. And then we spun that out eventually and, became its own thing. But then we linked that work into like a greater collaborative around My Brother's Keeper. We were able to kind of push for some policy changes, working with the county, Office of Diversion and others on more of the policy components that we actually had learned from our success with the Bloom Initiative. Like we couldn't have understood like what was successful about that effort. And we had researchers come in and tell us to be able to advocate for the policy things we needed without that work, right? And so I just think that if you're thinking about this work, you have to think about the entire ecosystem of folks working in different spaces and kind of linking that work up together to have a collective point of view or a set of actions that you're really trying to move forward on, wherever you fund in this space. I think that's how you really create action all across the board. So
that's super helpful. That's great. So this is a question that I think is going to go back to Superintendent Stiles, to Dr. Pearman, can be answered from a couple of different directions, I think. Is there a correlation between school funding and achievement and between school funding and the achievement and disciplinary gap?
Yeah. So maybe I'll jump in. So there's actually quite a bit of evidence over the last couple of years that's indicated that not only is there correlational evidence between funding, school funding, and achievement sort of levels, achievement outcomes, but there's causal evidence. The Carabao Jackson at Northwestern has spearheaded a lot of this work. And there's just simply
he was last month's speaker.
oh, that's great. Right. So yeah. And just to be clear, I mean, why that is even a question today about the connection between funding and achievement levels, whether funding is related to how well children do in school, is because for so long, a lot of that knowledge was based on what we might think of as sort of second tier research, research that had questionable identification strategies, right? Studies studies in which you were unable to say definitively that X caused Y, right? But in the last decade, there's really been an explosion of really good causal evidence about these connections. So yes, there's a strong connection there between funding and achievement levels. But your question specifically was about achievement gaps, and surprisingly, there's just simply less research that's looked at that question in particular. But considering sort of the broader patterns between spending and achievement levels, I mean, one would suspect that gaps would be sensitive as well. But I think that the jury is out still on the specific question you asked.
Helpful. I'm going to throw this one to you, Marlon. Does teaching to the test, as opposed to a broader curriculum that would allow for a class like you described on modern African American culture, does that teaching to the test contribute to the achievement and discipline gap?
I don't think that teaching to the test attributes to the gap as it speaks. I think as an educational system right now in the United States, we don't have districts that have equity plans, right? Our national education system doesn't focus on equity. It doesn't focus on excellence for all. And I'd say that about the state of Ohio as well. So I think we take the test out of it. Even if you look at local assessments, you'll find gaps that are present as well. And discipline is present as well. I think the focal point of this conversation is not necessarily testing. I think it's about the readiness levels that we're able to ensure that our communities are making sure kids are walking in with those high readiness levels right off the bat, right? So we haven't talked a lot about early literacy rates and if that plays a factor into the engagement levels and the achievement levels of our students. We haven't talked about the the literacy rates and whether they influence the discipline data that we're referencing right now. So for me, it's more about a system that focuses on values equity, a system that ensures that kids are ready to learn when they walk in the door, and that we're giving our best foot when they walk into our schools. So, I mean, testing is testing. It's a one-time pulse check on students. I think as you talk about local data that's not teaching to a state test, our local data still is going to show that we have both achievement gaps and discipline gaps will be present as a result of kids not being ready.
Awesome. I'm going to flip it back to you guys in LA. Are you concerned at all about local control funding formulas actually undermining equity efforts? We have several schools that have opened the door to resegregation under the guise of local control and accountability.
No, I mean, I would say that, you know, the local control funding formula and the LCAP are really intended to give power to the community to kind of determine, you know, where you're going to focus, what accountability measures you're going to focus on, and where that the resource should flow for that. What I would say, and this is a more nuanced kind of deeper dive into how funding flows. So it's not, you know, per pupil is always an issue. And in California, we're like in the bottom third, which is just, you know, outrageous for the size of the state and how much need we have. The local control funding formula is really trying to, you know, provide more resources to the students that need them the most. But districts control that, and districts have schools within them, and districts can determine that. So not all that money is flowing directly to the schools with the greatest needs. And we don't have enough transparency around that. I think we're fighting for that, or want to see that. But we also don't know if that money is being spent on specific interventions for those students, right? So for example, if you're getting money because you have a high level of English learners, but you do SAT for all, is that really geared toward the success of those particular students, or is it for all students? And that money has been really targeted for those particular subgroups of students, right? And so how do we know that money is being used on things it's supposed to be used on? Is it successful? Are those interventions successful? And then how are districts sharing how they're using that money on those interventions that they could learn from each other, right? And if, you know, to Marlon's example, if you're going to focus that money on you know, English learners and literacy, or, you know, low income students and, you know, literacy or whatever it may be, you know, how do we know that money is flowing towards that and we're being successful and people can learn from each other in that space? And so, anyhow, that was my take on how the LCAP and the local control work, the way the funding flows works, at least. I'm not sure if I answered the question just around school autonomies.
That's helpful. And while we're with you all, there was a question that says implicit bias in the perception of willful defiance. So, so is that part of what the conversation was, to kind of remove that in law? How can you say a little bit more about kind of how that understanding kind of moved itself forward?
Steve, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah. Can you ask the question again? I'm sorry.
The question is just, it's a shorty, so I'm going to take liberties. So basically, as the conversation moved at the policy level in California and the state law changed around willful defiance, was that conversation driven by the fact that implicit bias is driving a lot of the kind of disparities in suspensions to date? Like, how did that conversation evolve? What was the role of philanthropy advocates in getting that into, into the consciousness of the governor and all of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I would say is, you know, my understanding or my assumptions are, given sort of the nature in which willful defiance was used, it was so broad and sort of subjected to like how folks interpreted a specific event. And I think that because it was so broad and a teacher or an administrator can interpret an action by a student from across a variety of different sort of perspectives, it just created an environment where students were being suspended for like marginal things, and it was so much based off the interpretation of the actual individual doing suspension. I think what folks arrived at was, we have to stop this. We can't allow folks to sort of suspend for, you know, I've heard things like if a student threw a pencil, one teacher would suspend for it, another teacher wouldn't. And given such, it was so based off interpretation, I think it was, they found it to be not a good use of that suspension sort of code, and they put restrictions on it. So I think that's what alluded to it. It was broad, and then just opened it up to sort of like implicit bias, as the question mentioned. That if you have this sort of broad nature, I think those who sort of are mostly marginalized will be negatively affected by the just broad interpretation of what willful defiance could be.
Yes, I want to just, we had one more slide, which is around the challenges.
Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you for jumping in.
So there's one more slide. Hannah, if you could like move us to the next slide there. So to your, to some of the things we're talking about, there's still real challenges in the space. There's if there's labor and others who still believe that, too much leniency in this space leads to chaotic classrooms, bad behavior goes unpunished. Like you see that there's a lot of that bubbling up still, right? There's people who believe that districts are just gaming the system and keeping, suspensions off the books, putting students in certain classrooms as opposed to like suspending them. And that creates more challenges in there too. And then there's Campbell's Law, which is like, if you create any kind of accountability metric around this, which they have for state accountability now, people are trying to find shortcuts to game the system. And I also would add other things to this, which is like implicit bias and is prevalent in school districts. And not to say that all teachers or administrators feel that way. I'm just saying that, there's still a lot of work to be done in that space. To even help people's own understandings of that work. And so it's definitely not something that can be solved through policy necessarily, but a long way to go as far as advancement in the field.
Should have kept myself off mute. Well, we have a couple more minutes. What I'd love to do is just go down the line in order from of when you originally spoke. If there's anything that you would like to share, we've got a whole bunch of folks in philanthropy from all around the country. Closing word for what you hope philanthropy can help with and do in this space of equity and discipline. Dr. Pearman, you want to go first?
Sure. So I think, so much of what we've known about issues related to better serving students of color in school. A lot of that knowledge has been plagued in many cases by a lack of good data, right? I mean, the reason we talk about, test scores, the reason we talk about suspension rates is in part because those are the data that we have available to us. Right. There are considerable. There are many more questions related to racial equity in schooling that are certainly there. Right. I mean, you visit a school, you can observe them with your eyes, but we don't have good measures for them yet. I mean, I alluded to some of them earlier in my sort of closing remarks about sort of the more benign disciplinary procedures in school. I think over the next decade, there's going to be, I think, an important area of progress for sort of moving the conversations around racial equity in school is getting better data on issues, problems, disparities that in the past just haven't been able to be measured. Right. So I think that there's a lot of effort and need there.
Okay. Superintendent Stiles, anything to say here?
Again, just thank you for having me. Just very honored to be part of the group. My closing comments will just focus on a question that we heard up in Toronto that has just been keeping me up at night, and that's the fact that in this country, we've had the same question on the table for years, and that's who are we not serving? And today is a very clear example that we continue to not serve our Black and brown students. There's a huge gap that exists. And I would just say collectively from all sectors across the country that this becomes one of our top priorities in our K-12 public education system. So I'm a big fan of education clusters, which puts all parties at the table to dream up ideas and action plans to tackle this notion. My challenge to everyone present today, regardless of your title or position, is just make the priority to put a solution on the table to answer the question, who are we not serving?
Thanks. And one of you guys from the LA County Office of Education.
Yeah, I could jump in. I would just say from the philanthropic perspective, this work is not done. We tend to move on to things and there are some successes in this space, but I think to Superintendent Stiles, I was listening to him talk and I was like, yes, his approach is right. You need to have strong learning environments and lots of opportunity structures for students, which is really the way I think forward in this space, right? And so, yeah, it's just thinking about this deeper issues of equity in this space. Teaching and learning, supportive school environments I feel like, the next way we need to think about this work. So that's just my piece.
Well, we went over, but this was a great conversation. Thank you all for great questions. Thank you to all of the panelists for leading a really fantastic discussion. Thanks. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.